The RSI Polaris is easily one of the most anticipated ships in the history of the Star Citizen universe. As the first capital ship with the combat focus scheduled for release in-game, it opens up a multitude of possibilities with respect to multi-crew gameplay and the hopes of an evolution in how group play and teamwork is perceived by the Star Citizen player base. Being the first ship of its kind to be made available to players, the tip of the spear, as it's dubbed by the UEE Navy, brings with it the possibility of the fulfillment of grandiose visions that are a fundamental part of why I believe so many people were drawn to Star Citizen in the first place. Personally, since I pledged the Polaris, I haven't been able to stop daydreaming of the moment I took the command seat, my crew in the ready, and we lined up for our first jump point into the Pyro system, knowing well that the adventure that lies ahead of us was rife with danger of potentially large-scale space battles like into the Battle of Vega, an adventure, however, that we ourselves would write. But the Polaris, despite the fact that it will be the largest combat-oriented ship in the game come its release at the 2954 Intergalactic Aerospace Exposition, does not come without its weaknesses, so I decided to make this video to address that. This short presentation aims to address those weaknesses by building a fleet from a top-down perspective, with the Polaris as its focus. Bear in mind, I am not in any sense a digital animator, nor am I a military strategist by any stretch. I just did my best with the tools and knowledge resources I had available. Quick disclaimer, there are obviously numerous ways you can construct your fleet, and at this point, building a sizable fleet is difficult as multi-crew and general group gameplay isn't terribly rewarding given the current state of the game. But I'm making this video with hope and optimism for a brighter future for Star Citizen and multi-crew game loops being added and incentivized. With the hope that the experience I envisioned when first hearing about this game 12 years ago is still on the horizon. Now without further delay, let's get into it. But before we do, I'd like to take this chance to ask that you hit that subscribe button if you like Star Citizen content. Subscribing is a free way to help the channel, and though we've seen a lot of success early on, my analytics show that the majority of viewers still aren't subscribed. So do me a favor, get subscribed, plus click the bell icon so that you get notified when I put out new videos. Alright, I thought we'd begin the discussion by taking a look at the design of the Polaris so that we can discern where its weak points lie. And we'll start that by pointing out where its strengths with respect to combat are. And I figured the best way to do that would be by showing you where it could exert the most force offensively. Polaris has 5 gun turret positions. 2 of those are located slightly forward of the ship's midline, positioned on the top of the ship as highlighted by the green circles on your screen. The next 2 are located directly on the ship's midline, positioned on the sides, port and starboard. The last gun turret position is located just beneath the bridge or cockpit of the ship in the front, or bow if we're using ship speak. Finally, though not necessarily a gun turret, a small missile turret is located on the stern of the ship. However, for the purpose of this discussion, I will not consider the stern missile turret as a point of force exertion, as I envision it to be used almost entirely in a defensive manner. With that said, the entirety of the Polaris's force exertion capabilities lie forward of the ship's midline and can be roughly outlined using the red cone as shown on your screen. Bear in mind, I know of and did consider the Point Defense System, or PDS, that will come standard on the Polaris, but again, those are used entirely defensively and in my opinion should not be considered as tools of force exertion. Now that we visually examine where the strengths of the Polaris's firepower exist, we have to take notice of the vacuum that leaves 3 sectors of the Polaris exposed to enemies, 5 if we count the hull and deck, or top and bottom if you prefer those terms. This design makes sense when we consider the classification and intended use cases of the Polaris as a Corvette-class capital ship. When taking that into consideration, it's helpful to understand how corvettes are used in naval fleets of today. They're attack vessels. Their intended use is to aggressively pursue other ships of war with their high speed and maneuvering capabilities, as well as their powerful frontal array of guns. Given that CIG has stated that the Polaris will be the fastest of the capital-class ships, this parallel seems to be okay to be used for now. But if the Polaris is the tip of the spear, then what would be the shaft? If we're only considering ships currently flyable and in-game, then I can't find another example that would fit this position better than the Aegis Hammerhead. a heavy gunship used by the UEE Navy since 2760, whose primary role was that of a heavily armed escort vessel capable of defending against enemy fighters and bombers. Keeping with the trend, let's do a quick overview of its force exertion capabilities. The Hammerhead comes standard with two quad-size forward turrets located port and starboard of the ship's characteristic bow. Next, we have two quad-size forward turrets located on the ship's midline, port and starboard, and a quad-size forward turret on the midline deck. Finally, we have an additional quad-size forward turret located on the ship's stern. It's also worth mentioning that the Hammerhead commands a barrage of missiles from the bow of the ship, giving it offensive capabilities in a 360-degree firing arc. However, given that the missiles are inherently limited by the quantity that can be stored, coupled with the limited turret radius of the forward gun turrets, the central forward axis of the ship is not what I would term a full-time offensive sector of the Hammerhead. As such, it serves its purpose best as a tailing ship that provides defensive cover from fighters, missiles, and torpedoes from the rear of a fleet. At this point, given the firing arcs of these two ships, with the Polaris covering frontal engagements and the Hammerhead covering the rear, we could technically state that we have all bases covered. However, given the nature of flight through space, it isn't really realistic to expect these two rather sizable ships to keep a tight formation. During an engagement where velocities can vary drastically, it's reasonable to expect the distance between the two to vary significantly, thus leaving gaps in their defensive capabilities. So how do we address that? How do we fill those gaps? In traditional naval conformations, we would expect a large carrier-type ship to occupy that space as an anchor for all other ships to base their velocities off of. However, since we don't have a carrier-type ship in the game anytime soon, I've decided to sub in another ship that could also provide added utility to the fleet as a whole. Cue the Misk Starfarer, a ship that's most known for its primary role function as a fuel collection, storage, and distribution vessel. The Misk Starfarer lends the potential to extend a fleet's travel distance and reduce the frequency it would have to stop for fuel, a commodity that likely would not be guaranteed in systems that aren't governed or monitored by the UEE, such as Pyro. It also boasts a considerable firing arc by way of 3-man turrets and guns controlled by the pilot. As such, it's my top pick as a sort of bridge or anchor ship for the fleet. But we're still faced with several considerable gaps where talented pilots in light, medium, and heavy fighters could penetrate the defensive line. And for those gaps, I would take a multi-layered approach, mimicking the modern Navy's utilization of much smaller crafts on the peripheries to help mitigate penetration by other small crafts. Nearing the rear of the fleet, in my opinion, no other ship fulfills this role quite like the Aegis Redeemer. Heavily armed and multifunctional gunship designed to excel in combat and troop transport, the Redeemer is the only ship in the fleet thus far that possesses a firing arc with a full-time 360-degree force exertion capabilities. Despite its recent nerf, I think it to be the ideal ship to fulfill a role for the Polaris-centric fleet such as this. Now moving towards the forward of the fleet, I would choose something that could not only supply support and defense to the rear of the Polaris, but also provide additional bombing or torpedo pressure to other large or capital ships the fleet could be engaged with. And for that, no other ship comes to mind other than the Aegis Vanguard Harbinger. Without sounding like too much of an Aegis fanboy, the Harbinger brings size 5 torpedoes, a size 5 primary weapon controlled by the pilot, and an extra gunner turret that can aid in the shooting down or intercepting of incoming missiles and torpedoes. You could also sub in an F-8C if you prefer a lower crew requirement with more pilot-controlled guns, knowing that you would be sacrificing the additional torpedo power. With that, our fleet looks to be filling out nicely, as we have all sectors of our fleet covered by the firing arcs of at least one of the 7 ships we've discussed, with some firing arcs overlapping to provide extra coverage from enemies. Despite the Polaris being heavily armed forward of its midline, I firmly believe that a squadron of light, medium, and heavy fighters could penetrate during a frontal assault. Additionally, I think the left and right side flanks of the convoy could be penetrated using similar tactics. In order to address that, I would utilize smaller ships that could rotate around the fleet to intercept incoming fighters, with the primary backbone of the fleet being used to brush off enemy ships that proved particularly difficult. For that role, I would employ a staple of the UEE Navy, the F-7A, bringing in a total of 5 more fighters to cover what I believe are the most vulnerable sectors of this armada. Now that we have the fleet built, let's take a look at the total crew requirements that we would need in order to pull this off. First, let's work our way backwards, starting with the smallest crew requirements moving to the largest. Each F-7A has a crew requirement of 1. Given 5 ships, that puts us at a total of 5 required crew members so far. Next we have our vanguards, which to fully crew would require 2 crew members, so 4 plus the previous 5 leaves us at 9. Next, we'll move on to the Redeemers, with a minimum full crew requirement of 4 each. That brings us to 17 crew members for the peripheral ships of the fleet. Moving on, the Hammerhead. Absent a co-pilot would require 7, bringing us to 24 total party members so far. Further still, 4 are required for all guns to be manned on the Starfarer, absent again the co-pilot or commanding officer, putting us at 28. Finally, we have the Polaris, with a minimum crew of 6 to have all turrets manned, plus the pilot is 7. Just a note, this also includes the missile turret located in the rear of the ship, and that brings us to a total of 35. Mind you, this is skeleton crew for half the fleet. This also does not include the upcoming addition of engineering in whatever 4.x patch that content happens to land on. With that said, there is a major glaring issue here, a real elephant in the room type conundrum, which is really a talking point for an entirely different video, but I'll touch on it here. In the game's current state, 35 people is over 1/3 of a server's population, meaning fleets of this size simply aren't feasible at the moment. Additionally, even if you could band together 1/3 of a server's population, what's the point? There won't be anything for you to do, because odds are you'll be the only force of this size on your server. There would be nothing to fight. There would also be practically nothing to gain, as contract rewards are too low even for group contracts. The only thing to gain here is to say that you've done it, nothing else. Complication for forming a party this size aside, this is one of the most important things for CIG to work on right now, server meshing. In order for the stream to become a reality, we need to be able to log onto a server with at least 1,000 other players, and we need it to be stable, which is why I'm glad that CIG has recently walked back its promise for a 4.0 release. As much as it pains me, more content isn't the priority right now. New won't fix this, new won't expand the player base, and new won't help the game. Don't get me wrong, I want more content and gameplay loops just as much as the next guy, but I don't want my battle against server stability and bugs to be my greatest challenge. CIG needs to pay attention because the people making this possible is not one of their 1,200 team members. The people making this possible are the backers, the contributors, the white knights, the believers. So CIG needs to start focusing on giving back to them. With that rant done, I have to say I'm still hopeful. Actually, I'm optimistic, because if we ignore the recent .2 patch, the past few months have actually been enjoyable. And this just shows that when the CIG team of devs is focused, they can make great things happen. My only hope is that they can continue to do so. Because with IAE and the release of the Polaris just around the corner, Star Citizen is about to become arguably one of the most exciting game experiences the world has ever known. That's if they get server stability sorted out, and do this the right way. With that said, now that you've seen my fleet, show me yours. What ships would you bring if money and stability was no object? Plot twist though, try and keep your fleet in a similar player count in mind. Drop yours in the comment section below. Finally, don't forget to like the video if you appreciated this type of content, and subscribe if you want to see more. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, and I read every comment that comes across my channel. Lastly, my org is looking for members to crew our Polaris. Drop a comment if you're interested and we can chat. I'll be doing a live stream when server stability starts to come back. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that announcement. On that note, thank you for watching. See you in the verse.